Trade delegates from the Asia-Pacific region addressed broader economic concerns amid the presence of higher U.S. tariffs in the southern Korean island of Jeju. We have more on Press Perspective today. Hello and welcome to Press Perspective for this Friday, May 16th here in Seoul. I'm Min Sun-hee. Trade envoys representing the 21 economies under the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Forum touched upon trade here in Korea amid the Trump administration's tariff campaign. For more on this, I have Steven Borowiec with Japanese weekly news magazine Nikkei Asia here in the studio. Steven, as always, thank you for being here.
Nice to be back.
I also have independent journalist Jessica Stone joining our talk live from Washington, D.C. Jessica, it's a pleasure to have you with us.
Good evening.
Right, Stephen, we will start here in the studio. Trade delegates, as I mentioned in the short clip from the Asia-Pacific region, addressed economic concerns in the southern island of Jeju starting yesterday. They ended their talks today, that is Friday. What's the latest on that front?
Well, this is an annual meeting, but it has some added significance this year in that it's the first major multilateral trade forum since the imposition of tariffs by the Trump administration in the U.S. And there was quite a bit of uncertainty as to whether or not the participating members would be able to reach a kind of joint statement. They did reach a joint statement. Looking through it, it's perhaps not surprising that it's kind of short on specifics. So what it does highlight is the fundamental challenges that they are identifying in the current trade order. And they're saying all the kinds of the sort of right things about wanting to work together to address these on a multilateral level, and agreeing on the primacy of Apec as a main forum for economic regional cooperation, and expressing support for the role of the World Trade Organization. And this is all, I mean, this is all the kind of things that come out of these big meetings where, you know, 21 members may not agree on specific things that they're going to do, but they will agree on a certain spirit, a certain format, and things to that nature. So, I mean, we could also say that this is perhaps a bit disappointing, because if the takeaway from this is that they recognize the fundamental challenges, surely they were aware of the challenges before they all sat down to meet, and this is all a bit open-ended. But I guess we have to just recognize this as just one step in what I'm sure will be a long and a difficult process towards navigating a new and very uncertain global trading order.
Staying with that, Stephen, on the sidelines of the APEC trade talks, Trade, Industry and Energy Minister Duk-geun sat down with U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer to talk about, of course, tariffs. What are we hearing about that particular meeting? This meeting, of course, follows the one that we had back on Thursday between Chung In-kyo and Jamieson Greer as well.
Yes, well, we don't know much about An's meeting just because of it's taking place on the same day that we're talking right now. So. But Chung said a few things that I thought were interesting. And one of the things that he highlighted was the difficulty of responding to these tariffs on a kind of multilateral level, because each of these countries is facing a very different scenario. So for example, if you have the case of South Korea, this is a country that has a very comprehensive and a very old alliance with the United States, and has, you know, over the decades developed a lot of quite durable mechanisms for communicating with the United States, for cooperating militarily, and it's a major trading partner. In recent years, we've seen a lot of major South Korean companies undertake quite extensive investments in the United States. And so presumably they are able to lean on those things and to kind of look to these well-established channels. Other countries have will be operating from a quite different posture. The Financial Times had some interesting reporting out today about another U.S. ally in East Asia, Japan. And these Financial Times reporters in Tokyo said that the consensus among Japan's leadership is that they're going to kind of pull back from negotiations now, because they want to hold out for a deal that they feel is really in the best interests of their industry, particularly their auto industry. And so they cite Japanese officials as saying that the auto industry is their main area of trade with the U.S. And unless they can get the deal that they feel works for the Japanese auto industry, that they're going to kind of hold off for now. And so that's just one example of the kind of diversity that we're going to see among these APEC members and of any country that's trying to get access to the U.S. consumer market. And I think it just highlights the challenges of the participants who are down on Jeju right now, besides the heavy rain on Jeju. They've got
the rain here in the country. Jessica, speaking at a Saudi-U.S. investment forum in Riyadh earlier this week, U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent claimed South Korea came forward with very good proposals during last month's 2+2 meeting, despite its political transition period. Now, he did not elaborate, and speculation, especially here, has been mounting over what those proposals might have been. What do you believe would be the Trump administration, what would the Trump administration regard as good proposals in your view?
Well, I think we've seen the model in Saudi Arabia and in Qatar with these large purchase orders. I mean, you can never go wrong with a large announcement like that when it comes to Donald Trump, who wants to be seen as the deal maker in chief. And last month, Trump on Truth Social gave a little bit more insight into the type of deals he's looking for. He mentioned shipbuilding. He mentioned liquefied natural gas. Of course, the U.S. is the largest producer of liquefied natural gas and the largest exporter of, or at least has the largest export capacity. And it needs customers, right? Because they were bringing some of this back online after being downshifted during the Biden administration. Trump has mentioned this vulnerability of U.S. shipbuilding, and there's a number of analysis from the think tanks here in Washington talking about the potential for shipbuilding cooperation to increase between South Korea and the United States, because the U.S. has identified this incredible vulnerability vis-a-vis the Chinese shipbuilding industry. Partnering with Korea also gives the American military a place to produce these things that are already in the Pacific. The U.S. has identified China as the major military pacing challenge for U.S. military development. And the U.S. and Korea are actually already working together on some smaller nuclear reactors inside the United States for shipbuilding. So there's already a track record there. So I think that's one main area, LNG being another. And so the bigger the better is the signal we're getting from Saudi Arabia, for sure.
All right, staying with what Jessica has just said, Stephen, there has been quite a bit of talk here among pundits claiming that the country's shipbuilding industry can serve as a bargaining chip with regard to trade talks or tariff talks with the U.S. That being said, could you tell us a bit about this particular industry and its prospects, Stephen?
Well, Jessica kind of outlined the prospects. Maybe I could take a different tack and talk about how difficult this might be. And the reason that this is on my mind is I did an interview with an expert a couple of weeks ago, and I don't know if I can say his name, but who's just very skeptical about how to get this off the ground, if for no other reason than the U.S. has a number of legal and regulatory hurdles that would make it quite difficult for this to happen. I mean, if I understand the U.S. law correctly, for the U.S. military, they do not allow vessels to be produced in foreign shipyards. So like something that's going to be used by the U.S. military has to be produced domestically. That's just one thing. If you're going to revive shipyards in the United States, you face a real hurdle when it comes to having the right kind of skilled labor, just because shipyards have been operating at a very, very diminished capacity in the U.S. compared to what they once were. Shipyards require having large numbers of welders and other kinds of skilled tradespeople, and to undertake this kind of work in the U.S., you would need to have a very large training program to have enough people who are able to do that. Labor costs in the U.S. are also quite high. But at the same time, we do see when it comes to South Korea and the U.S., there is a kind of complementary nature to the two countries' economic relationship, and there has been for a very long time. And now we have, as we've laid out, South Korea has a quite advanced shipbuilding infrastructure here in the country, here in places like Goje Island and Busan and that whole kind of southern industrial belt. So there's no reason to believe that the two sides would not be able to cooperate in this area, and that this is, at the very least, while we are on the level of dialogue, I think it makes a lot of sense for both sides to attempt to home in on areas that are potentially complementary. But looking down the road, there does seem to be a number of hurdles towards actually making this kind of cooperation happen.
Right. Right. Right then, in response to the concerns raised by Steven, Jessica, I understand that U.S. lawmakers across the aisle stand together, if you will, with regard to rebuilding America's shipbuilding industry. Could you tell us a bit about their joint effort on this front and the reason behind the common ground, as well as, of course, its broader implications?
Yeah, and I was just looking through some of the talking points and the highlights of the shipbuilding law that's been introduced by Congress, the SHIPS Act. It was reintroduced in both the House and the Senate, and the goal is to build 250 ships in 10 years, in line with the executive order from the U.S. president that was issued last month. It does have bipartisan support, but I think it's going to be important to go back through those details given some of the skepticism that Stephen has mentioned, because it does look to be largely a law that is about bringing shipbuilding to the United States, to his point, to get around some of those regulatory hurdles. But this whole issue really takes on a sense of urgency in light of the mismatch between the U.S. and China. And it's possible that what the U.S. is really looking for is to bring a lot of the shipbuilding know-how from Korea into the United States. We've certainly seen that with some of the auto investments and other types of technology investments from Korean industry in the United States. So perhaps that's the path forward in terms of shipbuilding in particular.
Right. And despite the competition between China and the U.S., Jessica, recently they agreed to slash bilateral tariffs following talks in Geneva last weekend, I believe. What has been the response to this particular development there in the U.S.?
Well, it's not taking the pressure off major retailers. I mean, we saw this week this huge announcement of Walmart, the country's biggest retailer, saying that it's still going to have to raise prices. And small businesses across the United States who disproportionately rely on Chinese inputs and have smaller margins. Those margins, they're worried about being eaten up by these tariffs. Walmart pressuring Chinese suppliers even to go eat these costs. It's not going over well, and I think the general consensus is that this is a pause in trade tensions, not a permanent solution. And in 90 days, will these structural issues, these major differences that have been fairly long-standing, will they be able to just be negotiated away on top of all the other negotiations that Washington is doing with other countries?
Jessica, this is an impromptu question. So as you mentioned, Walmart did speak about the need to raise prices as soon as this particular month and all the way into next month. How has that announcement perhaps affected the sentiment of U.S. consumers with regard to the Trump administration's tariff policy?
Well, it's definitely putting a damper on expectations, but that hasn't had the same impact on the stock market in terms of, and of course, there's a difference between how the stock market reacts and Main Street reacts. But I think that Wall Street is still looking at this deal as a positive sign, whereas Main Street Americans are concerned that if they can't get their goods at Walmart for a decent price, they may just not be buying those things anymore or buying them in fewer quantities.
Right. Stephen, back here in Korea, a number of high-profile visits by American delegations in recent times, and their meetings, of course, with defense industry leaders in the country, has some pundits talking about greater potential growth in the country's defense exports. What more do you care to share?
Well, the most kind of high-profile visit was by Donald Trump Jr., and he met with some senior executives from Hanwha Group, and Hanwha is one of these very big and kind of up-and-coming South Korean defense firms. I'm not totally, I mean, the kind of holy grail for these South Korean defense companies is that they would ultimately like to break into the U.S. market because it's the biggest in the world. You know, the U.S. defense spending, I think, is larger than the rest of the world combined. That would be a real kind of advancement from how these defense industry firms have functioned in recent years. What they have done is look to leverage their speed and their accuracy and their reputation as being able to deliver precise orders on time to fill holes in the domestic arms industry, specifically in Europe, specifically to places like Poland and Germany and countries who are in the environs of the Ukraine war. When it comes to how a Hanwha or another South Korean company might seek to break into the U.S., I mean, that's a little bit beyond my expertise. I think you would have to kind of know the ins and outs of those companies a little bit better than I do to address that. But I do think that that's something that they will look to down the line, and that these kinds of high-profile visits to South Korea, if nothing else, they do indicate an interest on the part of major American players to see what's happening in Korea, to kind of see what the, I've been to a couple of these factories, and they're quite impressive in terms of the sophistication and the organization on display. I think that's something that Korea, throughout its industrial development, has leveraged. Bringing overseas guests here and showing them shipyards and factories, and having these visitors leave the country very impressed with the levels of organization and discipline on display. So we have to wait and see a little bit just how arms industry cooperation goes. But South Korean firms in the past year, their global profile has increased so much. I mean, you just hear so much more about South Korean arms makers in 2025 than you did a few years ago. And I think a lot of foreign observers of this very big and sophisticated industry have been wanting to get a better handle on what's happening here and where it might go. So I think we can understand these visits all in that kind of context.
Right. Jessica, you talked about how Walmart is thinking about raising prices in response to Trump's tariffs. Beyond Walmart then, what other industries, perhaps, if you will, businesses have been affected by Mr. Trump's tariffs? And do you suppose their actions with regard to raising prices or responding will perhaps encourage members of the American public, perhaps, to oppose tariffs in the long run?
Well, those are two separate questions, and they're certainly separate from any real impact on the administration's approach to this. I mean, the administration has taken a consistent approach, and certainly Donald Trump has been very consistent that he's pro-tariff. He was pro-tariff his entire non-political career, and certainly his political career as well, and started off tariffing everybody at a rate that was really unrealistic in terms of sustainability, particularly in the U.S.-China context. But in terms of American sentiment, I think when you poll Americans, they want to see the trade relationship with the U.S. and China addressed. They don't want to see the prices of goods go up, and they don't always see the connection between the two things. The Tax Foundation, which is an anti-tariff group, has done a study, and they just talked about how the duties will reduce after-tax incomes across the country by 1.2%, on average a $1,200 tax increase in 2025 per household. And as I said earlier, this again is very hard on small businesses which have narrow margins. So we're going to see the pain be on Main Street, not in these big corporations that are on Wall Street. And that is where you get some political pressure on congressional representatives. Having said that, Congress doesn't seem to be dissuading the president either from this particular approach.
I see. Meanwhile, here in this particular region, Steven's concerns over Mr. Trump's tariffs are also encouraging pundits to believe that South Korea should seek to perhaps expand its cooperation, economic ties that is, with its immediate partners, immediate neighbors that is, including China. There were talks between the Chinese delegation, the Korean officials with regard to trade also in Jeju on the sidelines of Apec. What is your view with regard to potential trade interactions between Korea and China?
Well, China is already South Korea's largest trading partner, and so it's a complicated relationship in that the trading relationship has, over the decades, kind of been predicated on South Korea holding a quite distinct technological advantage, and China having much cheaper labor than South Korea does. So South Koreans tend to import less complex goods from China, a lot of consumer products, a lot of things that don't require super advanced technology to make. And then going in the other direction are things like semiconductors and batteries and things that require the kind of technological know-how that is found here and perhaps not as readily available in China. That whole relationship is changing because, if you read the business press nowadays, you see how China is narrowing these technological gaps all the time. They're coming to not only catch up technologically, but as they're doing this, they're leveraging their vast workforce and they're being able to produce things at a cheaper rate. We see this in industries of all kinds. There was that earth-shaking news about China's homegrown artificial intelligence model earlier this year. And so when South Korean and Chinese officials sit down to discuss trade, I imagine it's very much a moving target that they're trying to hit. I'm not exactly sure where the obvious overlaps are in terms of how South Korean manufacturers can open up new markets in China, like what the demand is for South Korean produced goods, and then vice versa. The policymakers in those two countries and in every country are going to have to decide, like, do they try to wait out this tariff thing? Do they treat this as a temporary phenomenon, or do they treat this as a very long-term or perhaps even permanent reordering of the trading order? Do they seek to produce more things domestically instead of having to import them, or do they turn to other areas for potential economic growth? I mean, the context of this in Korea is that we are now in the midst of an election season where the big issue that's on everybody's mind beyond just basic political stability is how to address the weak economy, how to address low growth, how to bring more vitality to Korean main streets. And in recent years, as I've been writing about the economy here, there's always been this kind of duality where you have this one part of the economy that's doing super well that's export based, and it's exports of chips, exports of other advanced goods are doing really well. We saw some pretty alarming export data just recently of South Korean exports having been down quite significantly so far this month. And then on the other side, that other part of that two-pronged economic picture is quite weak domestic consumption and quite weak growth in a lot of South Korean cities. So if the happy side of the story is now facing all of these complications, the next administration is really going to have its work cut out for it. So I imagine that whoever's in charge will be wanting to hold discussions with major economies like China and Japan and the US to try to seek solutions wherever those solutions might be.
Right. Hopefully we'll get answers, or those solutions, we'll see a picture of them after the June 3rd presidential election here in the country. All right, Stephen, as always, thank you so much for your time and your thoughts.
Thank you.
And Jessica over in Washington, thank you so much for joining us live at this hour.
Good to be with you.
On that note, we end this week's editions of Press Perspective. Thank you for watching, and be sure to join us again same time next Monday when we address the latest on the presidential election campaign here on the local front.